When I joined the military, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Long months away from home, training in foreign lands, and the constant uncertainty that came with being deployed, it was all part of the deal. But what made it bearable, what kept me going even on the hardest days, was the thought of coming back home to the people I loved. My wife Asha was my rock, the one person who understood me like no one else did. And my brother Samuel was my closest friend, the one I could always count on, no matter what. We'd grown up together, Samuel and I. We were more like partners in crime than siblings. He was the one who had my back through everything, from late-night adventures to life's more serious moments. When I met Asha, it didn't take long for her to become part of the fabric of my life, and I could see how comfortable she and Samuel became around each other. They'd even joke about how they'd be okay if anything ever happened to me, something I never took too seriously at the time, because I thought I was untouchable, especially when it came to matters of trust. Before I left for my first deployment, I sat down with both Asha and Samuel, and we had a long conversation. I told Samuel that I wanted him to look out for Asha while I was away. I trusted him implicitly. We both knew that the distance between us during my deployment would be hard, but I felt confident that having Samuel close by would help Asha feel safe and supported. I didn't think twice about asking him to take on this responsibility. My brother was the kind of guy who would drop everything for those he cared about, and I knew Asha was someone he cared about deeply. Asha and I had always been close, but I could tell that the weight of my absence was going to be hard on her. The idea of being apart for so long made me anxious, but I also knew she was strong. She'd been supportive of me when I made the decision to enlist, even though I knew it scared her. Our relationship wasn't perfect, of course, but I believed in us. I believed in the foundation we'd built together, and I trusted that she would wait for me, just as I was committed to coming back to her. The first few weeks after I left were challenging, but Asha wrote me long letters and sent pictures of the little things she was doing. I could feel her love in each word, each sentence. I'd often stay up late, reading and rereading her letters, trying to savor her presence, even though she was miles away. Samuel also kept in touch, telling me how Asha was doing, checking in with updates about things back home. Everything seemed fine at first. My world was far from perfect, but it was manageable because I knew I had the support of my family. But as the months passed, things started to change. Asha's letters became shorter, less personal. Her responses to my messages started to feel more like obligatory replies rather than heartfelt words. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I thought maybe she was just busy with life, trying to manage everything without me. It wasn't easy for her, and I understood that. Samuel reassured me that everything was fine, that Asha was adjusting, and that I shouldn't worry. His words were a comfort, even though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Still, I pushed those thoughts aside. After all, she was my wife and I trusted her just like I trusted Samuel. But over time, the signs started to pile up. I noticed little things that didn't sit right with me. Asha would post pictures on social media, but she was always with friends or out doing things alone. There were no more pictures of the two of us, no more reminders of our life together. The photos she shared painted a picture of someone who was moving on, someone who didn't need me anymore. I told myself I was just overthinking it, that maybe she was just trying to stay busy while I was gone. But deep down, I felt a nagging unease, like something I couldn't quite put into words. I began questioning everything. Were we really okay, or was I just fooling myself into thinking that things would stay the same? I couldn't help but wonder if this distance between us, the physical and emotional separation, was pushing her away. But I always pushed those thoughts to the back of my mind. After all, I had so much else to focus on: duty, survival, the mission. The truth, however, was that as time went on, I was losing sight of the thing I cared about most: my relationship with Asha. And I had no idea that everything I was holding on to would soon come crashing down. Deployment was harder than I had anticipated. The long stretches of silence, the days that seemed to blend into one another, and the constant uncertainty took a toll on me. But there was always something to hold on to: my thoughts of home, the comfort of Asha's love, and the belief that everything would be okay once I returned. In the beginning, Asha's letters were a lifeline. Her words filled the gaps, and I lived for her updates, the little details about her day, her hopes, her reminders that she was waiting for me. But as the months dragged on, those letters became less frequent, less personal. I tried to convince myself that it was just the stress of life without me. She was probably busy with work, with friends, or just trying to keep herself together in the chaos. I told myself that I was being overly sensitive, that I was imagining things because I missed her. But as the silence grew louder, so did the doubts. At first, Asha's messages just became shorter. Instead of the long, heartfelt letters I was used to, I started receiving brief texts, often 1 or 2 sentences at best. Sometimes she wouldn't respond at all. I told myself it was just a phase, that she was going through something and needed space. I tried not to take it personally, though a small part of me began to wonder if there was something more going on. I even convinced myself that maybe it was just the distance, the emotional and physical distance, making things harder. Being apart was challenging, and I could hardly expect her to keep up the same level of communication when she was living her own life without me. Samuel, on the other hand, kept assuring me that everything was fine. Whenever I asked about Asha, he'd tell me she was doing great, that she was holding up well, and that she missed me but was staying strong. He'd make it sound so easy, so natural, as if nothing was wrong. He had always been the steady one, the rock in our family, so I believed him. He was my brother, my best friend, and I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? He had never given me a reason to doubt him. But over time, the cracks in our communication began to show in other ways. I noticed that Asha started posting more on social media, sharing pictures of herself out with friends, or exploring new places, without so much as a mention of me. I thought back to the days when I was home, how we'd share everything together, how we would go on little adventures and capture those moments in photos. I kept scrolling through her posts, looking for some sign of the life we used to have, but it wasn't there. It was like she was moving on without me. And the worst part, she seemed happier in those photos than I'd ever seen her when we were together. I remember trying to push away the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. It was probably nothing. I had no right to be suspicious, right? She was just doing what she had to do to get through each day, just like I was. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the unease that was settling in. I began asking myself if I was doing enough to keep her emotionally supported, but I couldn't come up with a clear answer. Was I being a bad husband by being away? Was I letting her down by not being there for her in the ways she needed? But it wasn't just Asha's behavior that made me uneasy. Samuel's reassurance, though comforting, started to feel like a cover-up. Every time I spoke to him, I noticed a change in his tone, almost like he was trying to deflect from the real issues. He'd say things like, "Don't worry, man. She's fine. She's just busy," but it never felt quite right. He'd often avoid answering when I asked about the specifics of what Asha had been up to or how she was feeling. His responses were vague, almost like he was hiding something. But I couldn't bring myself to believe that Samuel, of all people, would be involved in anything that would hurt me. The idea felt absurd. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I noticed something else, something that really set off alarm bells in my mind. I saw that Asha and Samuel had been liking and commenting on each other's posts, more often than seemed normal. They were both online at the same time, exchanging messages, sharing private jokes, all in plain sight. There was nothing overt, nothing that screamed affair, but the way they interacted felt strange to me. It felt like they were hiding something, like there was a secret I wasn't meant to know. Still, I pushed the thoughts away. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe I was just overthinking things. Maybe I was letting the distance between us cloud my judgment. But every time I looked at Asha's posts, every time Samuel reassured me everything was fine, a little voice in my head kept whispering, something's not right. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that this gut instinct was telling me something I didn't want to hear. The truth hit me harder than I ever could have imagined. I had spent months convinced that my suspicions were just the result of my own insecurities, overthinking, missing my wife, struggling with the distance. But I could no longer ignore the feeling that something was seriously wrong. It wasn't until I came back home from deployment that everything came crashing down in an instant. I had been counting down the days, counting down the hours until I could finally hold Asha in my arms again, to see her smile and feel like everything was going to be okay. The thought of finally coming home kept me going through the long, grueling days. But when I stepped through the door, expecting to be met with the familiar warmth of my wife and the love we shared, what I found instead was a cold, almost distant atmosphere. Asha greeted me, but it wasn't the reunion I had imagined. There were no tears of joy, no long embrace. It felt like I had walked into the home of a stranger. Asha seemed distant, almost detached, and Samuel wasn't anywhere in sight. I tried to push aside the feeling that something wasn't right, telling myself that maybe she just needed time to adjust to me being back. After all, we hadn't seen each other in so long, but something in her eyes, the way she avoided looking at me, the way she didn't really engage in conversation, told me that this wasn't just about distance. There was something more. I tried to shake it off and told myself it was just her being overwhelmed. I wanted to believe that more than anything, but as I walked through the house, everything felt off. The things that used to make our home, our shared photos on the walls, little keepsakes, our personal touches, seemed almost erased. The space felt emptier than I remembered. My mind started racing. I thought back to all those moments when I had felt that something was wrong, when I had convinced myself that it was just my imagination. But now, standing in the place where I had always felt most comfortable, I couldn't deny the gnawing feeling deep inside me. Something had changed. Something was wrong. Later that evening, when Asha was out of the room, I found myself standing in front of her phone. I hadn't meant to snoop, hadn't planned on checking anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but something in me screamed that the truth was hidden in there. Asha's phone had been left on the kitchen counter, unlocked, a small detail that felt like fate. My heart was racing as I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly as I unlocked the screen. The first thing I saw were the messages between Asha and Samuel. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The texts were full of endearments, words I had never seen exchanged between them before. There were inside jokes, flirtatious comments, and long, intimate conversations that I had never been a part of. My stomach dropped as I scrolled through the history of their conversations. It wasn't just casual talk, these were messages between two people who had crossed a line. My brother and my wife. The people I trusted most in the world. I kept reading, hoping, praying that I was misunderstanding something. That maybe this was all innocent, just a misunderstanding. But the further I read, the clearer it became. Samuel and Asha had been seeing each other. Not just texting or talking, they had been involved with each other. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. How could this happen? How could they betray me like this? I had trusted them both so completely. They were the people who knew me best, the ones I had counted on. And now they had taken everything from me. The messages continued to scroll before my eyes, each one a deeper stab into my heart. They had been talking about everything, how they missed each other, how they couldn't wait to be together again, how they had been sneaking around behind my back for months. It wasn't a one-time thing. It was an ongoing affair, something that had been building in secret while I was thousands of miles away, fighting for my country and thinking that everything back home was fine. I felt a surge of anger, disbelief, and heartbreak all at once. My vision blurred as tears filled my eyes and my hands shook uncontrollably. How could Samuel, my own brother, betray me like this? How could Asha, my wife, the woman I loved, do this to me? My mind raced and I couldn't process everything. I didn't know what to do, where to go. The world I thought I knew, the life I thought I had built, was crumbling in front of me. I couldn't stay in that house another minute. I needed air, I needed space to think, but all I could think about was the betrayal. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that it had happened, or the fact that I had been blind to the signs all along. How could I not see this? How could I not have noticed the changes, the way they both had pulled away, the subtle signs that something was wrong? I knew I had to confront them. I couldn't let this go. But part of me was terrified. How could I look them in the eye after what I had just discovered? How could I face them when everything I had believed in had just been shattered? But there was no turning back now. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The confrontation wasn't something I was prepared for, but I knew it had to happen. I could feel the weight of the betrayal settling heavily in my chest, and I couldn't just pretend everything was fine anymore. I couldn't ignore the truth, no matter how painful it was. After reading the messages between Asha and Samuel, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My mind was racing as I tried to figure out what to do next, how to even begin this conversation. But there was no easy way around it. I had to face them. I waited until Asha came back home later that evening. The house felt colder than it ever had before, the silence between us more suffocating than I could have imagined. When she walked through the door, I could tell something was different. She wasn't her usual self. Maybe she knew something was coming, maybe she didn't. But the unease in the air was impossible to ignore. I asked her to sit down, my voice steady but my insides were in turmoil. I couldn't look at her the way I used to, couldn't see the woman I had loved without seeing the betrayal first. I held up her phone, the same one I had seen the messages on, and I could see her face fall as she realized what I was holding. Her eyes widened, and I could almost see the panic flash through them. I know, I said, my voice quieter than I expected, but with a finality that made everything feel even more real. I know what's been going on between you and Samuel. She didn't respond right away. She just stared at me, and for a moment it felt like time itself had stopped. I wasn't sure what I had expected, maybe anger, maybe tears, but I didn't expect the silence that hung between us. When she finally spoke, it wasn't the apology I was hoping for, not the regret I thought would come flooding out. Instead, it was a hesitant admission, her voice small and broken. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said. I never meant for things to get this far. I felt a surge of anger flood through me, and I had to clench my fists to keep from losing control. How could you let it get this far, I demanded, my voice sharper now. How could you do this to me, to us, and with Samuel, of all people? She shook her head, tears starting to form in her eyes, but they weren't the tears of someone who was truly remorseful, they were the tears of someone who had been caught, someone who knew they had ruined something they couldn't fix. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she repeated, but her words sounded hollow, like she was trying to convince herself more than me. I couldn't look at her anymore. I couldn't even process her apology, if that's what it was. My mind was still reeling, still stuck on the fact that the two people I had trusted the most, the ones I had left behind to protect each other, had betrayed me in the worst way possible. Samuel, my own brother, the one I had confided in, the one I had trusted to look after Asha while I was away. How could he do this to me? How could he have been involved in something like this? Something so damaging to everything we had built? Without thinking, I turned to her again. Where is Samuel? I asked, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. I need to hear his side of this. I need to hear how he's going to justify it. Asha didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down, her hands wringing in her lap. The guilt was written all over her face, and it made me sick. He's not here, she said softly. He's been staying away, giving you space. I didn't wait for her to say more. I turned and walked out of the house, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind a mess of conflicting emotions. I needed to see Samuel. I needed to see Samuel. I needed to fear the truth from him, even if I didn't know how I could face him after everything. I had trusted him with my life, and now everything felt like a lie. I drove to his place, each mile feeling heavier than the last. When I pulled up to his house, I felt numb. I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but I couldn't just walk away without confronting him. When he opened the door, his face fell when he saw me standing there. There was no defense in his eyes, no attempt to explain himself. I could see the shame in his face, and for a moment, I wanted to believe that he was sorry. But I knew better. I knew that there were no words that could undo what he had done. What the hell, Samuel? I asked, trying to keep my voice even, though I could feel the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. How could you do this? How could you sleep with my wife? Samuel didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his gaze dropping to the floor. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. Sorry doesn't fix this, Samuel. Sorry doesn't make it okay. I wanted him to say more, to explain himself, to tell me that this was some kind of misunderstanding, but deep down I already knew. There were no words that could make this right, no excuses that would bring back the trust I had lost. The betrayal was too deep, and nothing could repair it. I turned to leave, the weight of everything pressing down on me. There was nothing left to say. The damage had been done, and no matter what either of them said, the relationship we once had was gone. The days that followed were a blur. I didn't know how to function, how to breathe, or how to even go through the motions of a normal life. The betrayal was suffocating, and every time I thought about it, I felt like I was drowning. The world felt like a lie, like everything I had built, everything I had worked for, had been destroyed in an instant. Asha and Samuel both tried to reach out, but I couldn't bring myself to talk to either of them. I didn't want to hear their apologies, their excuses. What good would they do now? Nothing could erase what had happened. The silence between us was unbearable, but it was the only thing I could hold on to. The only thing that made any sense. I needed time to think, to process what had happened, and to figure out what I was supposed to do next. I tried to focus on work, tried to distract myself, but it didn't help. I would find myself lost in thought, replaying everything in my mind over and over again. How had I not seen the signs? How had I been so blind? My mind kept going back to the moments when things had started to change, those little signs that I had ignored because I didn't want to believe the truth. The way Asha had become distant, the way Samuel's reassurances had felt more like deflections than comfort. All of it had been there, right in front of me, and I had been too naive to see it. There were moments when I wanted to lash out, when I wanted to confront them both and scream at them, to make them understand the pain they had caused me. But what good would that do? The damage was done. The trust was shattered, and nothing could put it back together. I spent a lot of time walking, trying to clear my head, trying to make sense of it all. But it never worked. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the reality of what had happened. I felt like I was carrying a weight that I couldn't put down, a weight that had been placed on me by the two people I had loved and trusted most in the world. The hardest part was facing the truth about my brother. Samuel had always been my rock, the one person I could rely on, and now he was the one who had hurt me the most. I kept telling myself that I should have seen this coming, that I should have known. But it didn't make it any easier. I kept thinking about all the moments we had shared, the times we had laughed, the times we had supported each other through everything. How had he gone from being my closest ally to the one who had betrayed me? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Anger was the one emotion I could still hold on to. It gave me something to focus on, something to channel my pain into. But even the anger wasn't enough to drown out the hollow feeling inside me. It didn't change the fact that my life had been turned upside down, that everything I had believed in had been ripped apart. At some point I knew I had to make a choice. I couldn't keep living in this state of limbo, stuck between the anger and the heartbreak. I had to decide what my next step was going to be. The thought of staying in the same place, in the same life, was suffocating. I couldn't imagine pretending like everything was okay, couldn't imagine going through the motions of a marriage that had been broken beyond repair. But I also didn't know how to walk away. The thought of leaving Asha, of walking away from the life we had built together, was more than I could bear. I tried to have a conversation with Asha, but it didn't go the way I expected. She was still apologizing, still trying to justify what had happened, but it only made things worse. I wanted to scream at her, to make her understand how deeply she had hurt me, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was sit there numb as she spoke. I didn't want her apologies, didn't want her explanations. I just wanted the pain to stop, but it felt like there was no end in sight. In the end, I realized that there was no easy fix. There was no magical solution to make everything right again. I couldn't just go back to the way things were, and I couldn't pretend that I hadn't been betrayed. The trust that had been broken could never be repaired, no matter how much either of them apologized, no matter how many promises were made. I decided that I needed to leave. I didn't know where I was going, or what my next move would be, but I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep living in a house that held all the memories of a life that was no longer mine. Walking away from Asha was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I knew it was the only way forward. I had to find myself again, had to rediscover who I was without the lies and the betrayal weighing me down. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but I had to try. The hardest part of all of this wasn't just the betrayal, it was the uncertainty. The feeling that nothing in my life was certain anymore, that the future I had once imagined for myself was no longer possible. But even though I didn't know what the future held, I knew that I had to move forward. It was the only choice I had left. I walked away from the life I knew, from the woman I thought I would grow old with, and from my brother, the one person I had always trusted. But I had to do it. I had to find a way to heal, to rebuild my life, even if it meant leaving everything behind. The pain was real, and the loss was deep, but somewhere in the back of my mind I knew that I would be okay eventually. The road ahead would be difficult, but I couldn't keep living in the past. It was time to take the first step into an uncertain future.